Hello, everyone. Welcome to Doctors Making a Difference. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Crane. I'm a physician in rural Idaho where I've been in practice since 2011. Over the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to be both a physician and a patient, and I've been so thankful for the doctors and other healthcare professionals who have helped me. I invite you to join us as we highlight physicians around the world who are making a difference in their communities and with their patients. Our goal is to give physicians and other healthcare professionals the tools they need to be successful in medicine, in finances, and in life. What we do makes a tremendous difference for our patients and our communities. Please go to your podcast service or YouTube channel and give us a 5-star review and hit the like or subscribe button. It helps get the message out to others. You can also check out more content on our website, doctorsmakingadifference.com. Finally, if you would like to be on the show or have any questions or topics that you feel should be addressed on the show, please contact me. The easiest way to get in contact is to subscribe to the newsletter and then hit reply to any of the newsletter emails. Welcome to the Doctors Making a Difference podcast. Today we've got my friend Kevin Schopmeyer on the show, and I appreciate Kevin taking the time to be here with us today and talk a little bit about his life and his experience. And Kevin, do you mind just introducing yourself to our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Kevin Schopmeyer. I grew up in Brazil, which is pretty much, is pretty cool, except when I tell people it was Brazil, Indiana, then it's not so cool.
I still think it's
But
cool.
yeah, small town Indiana, Midwest guy, and kind of had a circuitous path to get into medicine, and but just felt like things have worked out. Um, for me, even though I was kind of non-traditional student, and but it's been a good ride.
That's awesome. So Kevin and I have known each other since residency days, and I remember I was a year ahead of you in residency. I remember thinking that like, hey, this is a pretty cool guy. Like not the traditional path, but you came to the residency already with a little family and ready to go. And I guess maybe just to kind of start off a little bit, coming from Brazil, Indiana, why medicine? Why did you decide to do that? Because it's not an easy road.
Yeah, I think all growing up, that was pretty much I guess I would say a dream, because I didn't have, a well laid out plan, because I didn't know, the path and everything that needed to be done to get there. So it was just kind of always a dream growing up. My dad was a truck driver, over the road truck driver, and my mom was a school teacher. So I didn't have a lot of access to find out, what is medicine. We didn't have Google back then. What does it take to be a doctor? So it was kind of a learning experience to get to that stage. And I just kind of took it a step at a time, and deviated along the way a little bit. But I think every kid has occasional dreams of being a fireman or an astronaut, and I had those for short periods, but kind of ever since I was 5 years old, being a doctor was a plan, or the dream. I wouldn't say that I knew how to get there necessarily, but I always thought it was a pretty cool profession to be able to help people, and and that was always what I wanted to do pretty much all through school.
That's neat. I think a lot of us can relate when you think back to the pre-medical time or even our teenage years and say, this is what I want to do. And we titled this podcast, Doctors Making a Difference. And I think that for me, that kind of signals the idea that all of us started out this journey, whether a little bit altruistic or just the desire to make a difference in the world or help somebody around us. But it is kind of it has to be a lengthy journey to become a physician, and so you have to find that reason that you would stick with such a long path. And it sounds like you did. That's interesting that you really didn't have access to any medical background as far as family members. Did you have any friends growing up or anybody like that that inspired you toward that
I mean, we had
direction?
a dentist that went to our church, so he let me have some insights into the dentist world, but really wasn't the same. And during high school, I did reach out to a couple, local physicians, but I really didn't get a lot return. Obviously the busy, and I was just a high school kid, so I can understand that. But I really had a hard time like breaking in to find out what medicine was about. So I pretty much just went from high school and went to pre-medicine in Pensacola, Florida, and with a plan to go to medical school, and kind of got beat up in pre-med. So it was very challenging, and I went to it was a pretty strict college, and they had a lot of extra rules and things like that. So um, and I just didn't do well. I had just under a 3.5 GPA, which was good enough to get in, but I didn't think it was, and it was. I had to work so hard to get that. I was like, man, I'll never make it in medical school. So I kind of bailed out on the dream after college and ended up getting a master's in sports medicine and exercise physiology and got into teaching and coaching. And I was actually an athletic director at a school, a private school in West Palm Beach before I went to medical school. So I kind of went from the coaching, teaching career into medicine, and partially thanks to my wife, Hannah, who we were dating, and she said, why did you go to pre med and never went to medical school? And I just told her, I said, I thought it was too hard. I didn't think I could make it. And she said, well, would you still want to be a doctor? And I said, well, yeah, I always thought it would still be cool. And she said, well, if that's what you want, we're going to get there.
No, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, she really gave you some motivation. But and I think like we were talking before the podcast started, I think one of the best things to hear is when people just have real life stories, because it's not, in hindsight you can paint it as this perfect picture, but it's not how it is for most people. It's you step from one thing to another, and you're placed in different situations, and you have the opportunity to affect different people. But the real path is getting there. I remember when I was in the pre med phase, shadowing a guy that was working in an emergency room, and he shared a similar story. He's like, "Yeah, it took me 5 times to get into medical school, but I love it. I'm so glad I get to do this job." And he was excellent at it. I
Yeah.
enjoyed working with him, and so not everybody has this perfect pathway lined with everlasting success. And I don't think that medicine necessarily has to just attract people who are the 4.0 student who always just has everything work out, because it is so much of a, you have to be able to pass the test for sure. But the actual job, when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of what is medicine, it's mostly about finding and serving other people and being able to relate. And so that coaching, teaching background that you have may serve you better than just about anything else in the day by day activity. I was curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think definitely it did. It definitely helped me a lot having that real world experience. Helped me during medical school because I had so many mentoring physicians that I would hear complain about their long hours, about the stress that they were under, and I was like, I had that at my last job, and you guys made a lot more than I did. Are making more than I did. So I realized that the stress and the long hours happen for everybody. That are trying to be successful in life. Almost everybody has stress and long hours. And so as a physician, I think we're compensated well for the stress and long hours. I think there's people who make better than we do, but I think the majority of the world has stress and long hours, and obviously their compensation is less than ours. So that kind of always helped um, just keep me kind of grounded and stable when I was hearing people complain during my residency and training, because I had that real world experience and I knew that everybody went through the same stuff. Maybe not always life and death stuff, but it was it was always stressful. When I was the athletic director, parents and when games didn't go the way the parents wanted to, or kids weren't getting to play, they're breathing down your neck, and that's stressful, in its own right. And if your program's not doing well, you may be in jeopardy of losing your job, and that's challenging and stressful. And you're obviously not, teachers don't make what doctors do, so but everybody deals with stress and long hours, I think, if they're trying to be successful what they do.
It's an interesting observation to, I think, regardless of what somebody does. But if you look at someone who is quote unquote successful, and you kind of ask, what's the secret to success? And usually the answer is a whole lot of hard work. No
Yeah,
matter what that is, you only get a few
yeah,
decades of sort of productive life, in this life. And if you look and say, well, that person seemed to have it all figured out. They had a great family, or they had a successful career. They were able to do all these things. And when you look at it, it usually is a lot of work. So whether you're a teacher, an athletic director, or a business owner, or a physician, or all those things together, I think that we have the opportunity to make a huge difference in the world around us. But it does, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, require a ton of work.
yeah. Yeah, so just continuing my story, my wife actually paid for a Kaplan course for me to take in the summer, after coaching and teaching, so I did that the first try and took the MCAT, and I did okay. And I actually applied to a osteopathic school in Fort Lauderdale, and I had shadowed an osteopathic doctor, and my application was complete, and they pretty much told me that I would get in as soon as they got his letter. Well, he ended up in the ICU with kidney failure from contrast dye nephropathy, and never got my letter done. He had it on
Wow.
his desk ready for his secretary to transcribe it, and he just never gave it to her to transcribe. And the deadline went by without my letter ever getting there, and so I ended up missing that osteopathic medicine route. And so the next year I took the MCAT again, studied a little bit differently, and took the MCAT again, and did a little bit better. And I applied to schools all over the country, and um, had an interview, and didn't quite my GPA and MCAT scores weren't enough. I did well in the interview at a state school, and so but then my wife again found the St. George's University down in the Caribbean, and we actually had some friends who I worked with that had a baby that had a aplastic left heart, and we were spending a lot of time with them at Miami Children's Hospital, taking them food and whatnot while they were going through that ordeal. And they were very grateful. They knew I was trying to get into medicine. They said, "Hey, we're going to ask the doctor our cardiologist, if he'll write you a letter of recommendation to get into medical school." And I was like, "Well, you don't have to do that, but it's very kind." I was kind of very anxious to get in, and so we went with them to the autopsy. Their baby ended up dying, and we went with them to the autopsy report. And at the end of the autopsy report, they asked the pediatric cardiologist. They said, they introduced me and said, "This is our friend. He's trying to get into medical school. Would you be willing to write him a letter of recommendation?" And he said, "Yeah, where are you trying to get in?" I said, "Well, right now, I'm looking at St. George's University in the Caribbean." And he said, "Well, that's where I graduated from."
Oh, wow.
And so,
What
it
coincidence.
just overwhelmingly just one of those coincidences we run into. And so he wrote me a letter, and obviously I got into St. George's, and ended up doing 2 years in the Caribbean, and then 2 years in Detroit in my clerkships, and then finished up there, and was started the residency journey. And that, I guess, that's where our lives intersected.
That's right. Well, you and I both went to residency in Indiana. You were returning back closer to home to Brazil, Indiana. I was traveling from Idaho, as far away from my home, but it was a great place to train. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah, it absolutely wasn't my plan to come back to Indiana. We were wanting to get back to Florida as soon as possible, and I actually had done a rotation down in Florida, in family medicine. But it was just some weird things happened, and I didn't feel comfortable with that program. And so, when I did the residency application, I think you get so many for a certain fee that you can put on there. And I was like, man, I had one more program. And as a foreign medical grad, we kind of look, is this program, foreign medical student friendly? That was one of the things I looked at. Do they have other residents from foreign medical schools? And I got to, I was looking at ball and I noticed, oh, the compensation's a little bit higher than everybody else, but, no foreign medical grads. And I was like, oh, that'd be close to, my wife's family. They lived about a couple hours away. And I was like, well, I have one more. Seems like good training. And, I'll just go ahead and mark Ball Memorial Hospital as my last spot. And, I got an interview and, man, just was overwhelmed by one, the thing that drew me into family medicine, and that was how great the people are. The doctors that I worked with in medical school, I liked those physicians the best. They seemed down to earth and reasonable and really cared for their patients. And I found that at Ball. Throughout the program, the faculty as well as the other residents were all super nice, super cool, and and the training was far and away superior to the other residencies that I was looking at. So I just felt that Muncie was going to be went to number one on my list pretty quickly.
Well, it turned out to be a great place to train. It really was. I think about, now you and I are a decade or more deep into attending just into our regular jobs. And I look back at that training every day. I mean, I think back something I learned in residency from one of our mentors, probably on a daily basis, like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. And I'll think back to something, and I will have, just like you do, hundreds and hundreds of experiences since then. But that the seeds were planted at that time to allow us to become, and I think about those excellent mentors that took the time to train us. And I know that's across the whole United States. There's people that trained learners, and it kind of creates this legacy that is ongoing. So it does make a big difference, and then we can take it back into our own practices. One thing I was thinking about, Kevin, is as you did get to go back to Florida, and you've been in a practice there. I'd like to hear a little bit about your practice and what you ended up doing, the kind of community it is, and what type of people you serve in your business.
Yeah. So yeah, after residency, I stayed in Muncie for 3 years.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that.
Worked there. Yeah. So, and I was doing the rural ER thing, moonlighting. I think you did some of
I
that too.
did, yeah.
So I continued to do that through my first 3 years of practice. I developed and ran a bariatric clinic for the hospital. And I had a full practice by the end of the 3 years in addition, and we also started a disability company. So it was like I also did exercise testing at Ball State. So I was like working like 6 different places,
Holy
and
cow.
was kind of run myself kind of thin. And Baptist, we had interviewed at Baptist Hospital in Pensacola at the end of residency, more of kind of a way to get out of the cold. They offered us an interview, and so we came down and had interviewed, and it just didn't make sense financially, and so we were actually on vacation in Destin, Florida, and I got a call on my phone from the recruiter from Baptist. This was 3 years after we had interviewed. I was 3 years deep into my practice at Muncie, and doing a lot of work. And they said, we have this new opportunity that has arisen, and we think you might be interested. And just the day before, we had walked outside, and I said, "Man, we should have moved to Florida." And my wife said, "I tried to tell you we should move to Florida."
With the
And
temperature.
yeah, and so the next
That's
day,
awesome.
Baptist called. It's almost like they heard us talking. Called and offered me this job. At It's actually a very unique clinic. It is the building that I'm in. The east end is a Florida Blue retail center, and the west end is my office. So it's the Florida Blue contract subcontracts my hospital, Baptist Hospital, to staff the clinic. And so we work for Baptist, but we only see patients from Blue Cross Blue Shield. So it's kind of a unique
That is unique. So it
system.
only
So
accepts those two insurance policies
yeah, so
for
we only
that
have Blue Cross
clientele.
Blue Shield insurance. We do take any type of Blue Cross Blue Shield, whether it's Florida Blue or Blue Cross Blue Shield Alabama, but that's the stipulation for us to be in the be in the clinic is to only take Blue Cross Blue Shield. And so coming down, it was a good situation where they were on a practice compensation model. So I had a very low overhead, because the clinic has a pretty small footprint. And obviously, I knew all my patients were going to be insured. So with the practice compensation model, that made a lot of sense. And they actually, my original offer was exactly what I had made the prior year in Muncie, working six different
Six
jobs.
jobs. Yeah.
Yeah.
How
So,
interesting.
so that was, that was kind of like only made sense. I was like, this is our chance to, go to Florida. It's, the panhandle of Florida. So it's, I don't have to, I didn't think I was going to have to be bilingual to do the job. But turns out this area of Florida, I have patients from all over the world, which is pretty cool. Partially because of the military influence in this area, but there just seems to be like a lot of different nationalities here, so it's really cool. I have patients from Ukraine and Lithuania, Croatia, like all like the European countries, and then I also have a lot of Vietnamese and Thai and Chinese and just all over. It seems like all over the world we get people coming into this area, and so I have a really diverse population, which is pretty cool.
That is cool. Do
Yeah.
you learn any of the languages? I don't know if I can't remember if you spoke another language. I don't remember that.
No, I don't. I don't get too much more. A word here and there, but fortunately, we have a really nice translating service. Via an iPad, and so basically, we just dial up a translating service on an iPad, and they do all the translating for us. So it's there's a person on the other end doing the translation who has some medical knowledge, with a lot of the vocabulary and stuff in both languages. So it works out pretty well.
Well, you serve quite a population. Interesting that people from all over the world come there and somehow find themselves in that clinic with that particular type of insurance. A lot of folks find themselves between insurance, but for whatever reason, while they're there, they've got that kind of insurance. They can come to you and you can help them out with your broadly trained background.
Yeah. Well, the having the retail center right next door, so they kind of bring people over, and say, hey, if you don't have another doctor you're looking for, this is a clinic here that you can register for. So I think that's the way we get a lot of those people. Once they have that insurance, they find our clinic pretty quickly there.
Do you see adults and pediatrics or obstetrics, or what is the spectrum of your practice?
Yeah, so when I was in Muncie, I was doing everything. I was doing inpatient, outpatient, peds, adults, delivering, working in the ER. So I was picking up patients from all over the place. I had a pretty, I would say probably about 20% of my patients were peds when I left Muncie. But now, just due to the, kind of the nature of the clinic. I picked up mostly adults. I have some teenagers and a few younger kids in teenage years, but mostly 8 years old and above. I would say I don't think I see any little ones, and definitely no babies. So we don't even really offer less than two, just because of the vaccination stuff, that we don't have all those vaccines available at our clinic. Um, so it's mostly adults. Probably I'd say 90% adults or more. So really lost my pediatric population. And
Well, it is a challenge as you go on. You kind of stay good at the things you keep doing. I suppose that's for all of us because as a family doctor, you're trained so broadly. You can do a whole bunch of stuff, and yet you have to either narrow and just focus on one thing, or have a job that keeps you super broad for a long period of time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, when I finished residency, I felt like you feel like Superman. You can do anything. You can do minor surgeries. I think you were you doing appendectomies and
No, no, I didn't do that. We trained with the surgical obstetrics. So in my
yeah,
practice, we still do C sections and obstetrics and a lot of because I still work in a rural area, so we cover the ER and the inpatient and all that stuff. But
okay,
but it is interesting that background. You get trained to cover a bunch of stuff. And at least if you don't practice those things, you know a lot about it, and you can find your way through that. Help people kind of direct themselves to the right type of care that they need.
Right. Yeah, I was doing C-section training until, I just kind of realized I probably wasn't going to live somewhere that was going to allow me to continue that practice. So I think after I did my first one solo, I was like, this is probably longer than you wanted to stand here, to the attending physician. I was like, I know, this probably, I don't think I'm going to continue to do these because it's not, fair to you to continue to train me if I'm not going to continue to do this, procedure. And that's kind of how I've always looked at medicine and training. I feel like, for me, the world is underserved from physician standpoint. There's not enough physicians to cover the amount of patients. So I'm always, trying to do the best for the most people. And so, I think a lot of the procedures that I've done, like derm procedures, I did a lot of that when I was in Indiana. And you would think, oh, you moved to Florida, you would be doing a lot of derm procedures. But when I got here, there's a lot of dermatologists. So I'm like, some of these procedures, they're taking my time from when I could be managing somebody's diabetes or COPD or one of these other disease populations where there's, obviously a plethora of these patients. And if I can send, a skin procedure to a dermatologist who is going to do them very quickly and allow me to see two or three patients while I would be doing this procedure, it just kind of made sense to me to kind of maximize my time to be able to help as many people as I can. So I'm always trying to curtail my practice, and so I'm pretty minimal right now as far as procedures. I do joint injections, and I still do some cryo stuff, and I'll drain an abscess if it's really bad. But I'm kind of down, almost feel like internal medicine now, with in addition to a few pediatrics. I'm just kind of doing the medicine stuff more than anything.
Well, it sure helps the patients that you're helping. I One of the things that has allowed you to do, and I'm hoping you'll be willing to talk a little bit about this, is your family is awesome, Kevin. You've been able to raise this wonderful family, and you've had an opportunity to do some adoption, and if you'd be willing to talk about that, I think that's a really important part of your story.
Yeah, so it was something that we kind of weren't planning on. It kind of, again, I just think of, I think God is in control of all of our lives. And I think I really, when people ask me why I moved to Florida, I really think I moved here to adopt these four kids. So we moved down to Pensacola with three kids. I think Liliana was 10 at the time, 8 or 10. I think she was 8 when we moved here. And we lived here for a year. We had a 1,600 square foot cottage on the bay that was a little fishing cottage, and we had two girls and a little boy, and we had tossed around the idea of maybe someday adopting another little boy, so our little boy would have a buddy to hang out with, but nothing serious at all. We weren't looking into that at all. But we were attending a small church down the road, and were teaching our son's Sunday school class. He was 3 or 4 at the time, and this little boy came into the Sunday school class, and my wife and I were just kind of drawn to him. He was this little round-faced little boy. He couldn't talk, or he wouldn't talk anyway. He just had this big old smile, and um, he just wouldn't talk, but we just felt drawn to him. And after the class was over, we had found out that he was on emergency placement in the foster system with a family in our church. He had been removed from a house that was abusive, physically abusive, and that had been the 15th house he was in. He
Wow.
had been taken in and out of homes. Um, and then we found out he had two brothers and a little sister. And so the little sister and the little boy were with the family in our church. and the older two boys were in a group home in another town, and they had been put together and separated because they were really hard kids. They were wild, and people most usually couldn't handle them. And then sometimes they would be removed because they were being abused or neglected, locked in rooms, and not only given food and no communication type stuff. So they had been through a lot. They were removed from their parents because their parents were obviously drug into drugs, and one of the boys had saved his mom from drowning in the bathtub when she overdosed in the bathtub. He was 4 at the time, so they had just been through a ton of stuff. So anyway, when we met David, that's who our son now. His name was Gabe at the time. Um, we called the foster system and said, "Hey, we found out, we met David or Gabe, and he's his we know he's up for adoption. We would like to maybe adopt him." And we got this really angry lady on the phone at the adoption agent. She's like, "Well, he's already up for adoption, and if don't even try to get him because you'll never get that kid. He's already up for adoption." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I was like, "Well, can we still get some information about the process?" And she's like, she told us about there's adoption classes. They last 8 weeks. The next one starts in January. But if you want these kids, don't even try because you'll never, they're already up for adoption. And so I was like, okay. So my wife and I were planning to take the adoption classes just because we thought, if this situation ever comes up again, we'd like to be ready. If we do ever meet a kid in a foster system, and at that time we didn't know about the foster system. We didn't, we I guess we knew, but we didn't know what a crisis it was, and how many kids were involved, and that there's 500,000 kids in the foster system that need to be adopted in the United States, and just what the need is. So we were helping the family in our church. They already had 2 children. They had 2 that they were trying to adopt, and then they had little David and his sister with them. And then the father ended up getting deployed to another state, and so it was just the mom with these 6 little kids. And she is like, "I'm going to have to put the 2 youngest back into the foster system because I cannot handle them. They're pretty wild." And so my wife and I asked her if we helped her out with a nanny. And we said we'll take the kids in on the weekend. We'll take the David and Paige. Their names now are David and Paige. We'll take them on the weekends, and just because we felt, we kind of felt drawn to them, but we just didn't want to see them go back in the foster to another potential bad foster home before their adoption went through, because they were planning to be adopted by a family in Ocala. So my wife and I, or my wife, found a nanny for them, and so she would help the lady through the week with the kids, and we would take David and Paige overnight on the weekends. And she called us in October and said, "Hey, I just heard there's another class opening up in November. You should call and see if you can get in it." So we called and asked about the class, and they said, "Yeah, actually 2 people just dropped out. You can have their spot. It's only 4 weeks." And
Oh, that's
so
quite different. Yeah, the lady
yeah,
had told
so
you
it was
January and 8 weeks, and you were
yeah, so
a lot
we
sooner with
got
four
so
weeks.
traditionally there are 1 class a week for 8 weeks. This was 2 class a weeks for 4 weeks. So we got into the class, and we were going through the class, and on the day of the last class, my wife gets a call from the foster agency, and they said, "Hey, we know you're interested in these kids. Their adoption's still planned to go through, so you're not going to get the kids. But the older boys' group home is shutting down. Would you be willing to take the older boys into your house for the holidays?" This is like 2 weeks before Christmas, mind you. So we're like, "Sure, we can do anything for 2 weeks." So they said, okay, we'll be out to do your home study tomorrow. And we're like, we hadn't even taken the last class yet. And so we got them to do the home study on Monday so we could have the weekend to, do all the things you need to do to get ready to take foster kids into your house, like put locks on your medicine cabinet drawers. And you had to have alarms on all the windows and doors. And so there's all these things you have to get done. We had to get a couple more beds and rearrange bedrooms. And so there was a lot to do. So actually, my office manager at the time and her husband came over and they helped us, do all these things that we needed to over the weekend. They came out on Monday, they approved us, and they said, okay, we'll drop off the boys on Wednesday. And um, so they were going to drop off these older two boys who had never met on Wednesday. And the next day they called us and said, hey, we know you're interested in these kids. Their adoption just fell through. Will you take all four of them for adoption?
All of a sudden, just like that.
Yeah, just all of a sudden like that. And we said yes,
Wow,
sight
Kevin.
unseen with the older two boys. And, we just kind of committed that once we say yes, there's no other answer, and
Wow.
had we not made that commitment, or had we met the older boys, we may not have, because they were
I'll bet.
they
I'll
were
bet.
wild. We,
I'll bet it
we
was a
thought the
big
younger two were
challenge.
wild, the older two were probably worse. So it was it was a big change in our life. And we went from five of us in the 1,600 square foot house to now nine of us in a 1,600 square foot house. We had one bathroom with a shower and tub in it, and we had a half bath. So that was a lot of people to get through, bath time and all these things. So um, in the first 6 months, it was they had dealt with so much trauma and had been in and out of so many houses, that and had just never been parented. So it was really tough. We had to have, if my wife and I were not present, we had to have two other adults to help us, um, manage the kids, just because it was chaos. um, and even though I was making a good salary, to get that help, we still ended up, $25,000 in the hole, above my salary in those first 6 months, just due to the amount of help we were trying to get these kids. So it was a lot, and I can understand how all these other people that had tried to take them in, they couldn't handle it, without help and resources, that we were able to, because we barely handled it with all those things. And it was hard. And I remember praying one night, and I said, God, I'm going to help these kids because I know they're your children, but I'm just scared about what it's doing to my children. And you hear that still small voice in your ear, and he says, I just felt him say, don't worry about it, they're all my children.
Hmm.
And so there were just so many things like that happened, that just gave us those reassurances that we were going to get through it. And sure enough, about the 6 month mark, things did start to get better. And once the kids felt that we loved them and they felt safe, they really started to calm down. And we started to make some real progress after that first 6 months. I remember when the boys first came into our house, my wife was like, these boys need discipline. And after they had been there a couple of days, she said, you know what, they really just need loved. And so that was kind of our philosophy change, from not knowing what we were doing to starting to figure it out, was when we just started trying to make them feel safe and loved, was when we started to make progress. Um, we did some training called trust based relationship intervention, that really helped us. It kind of encourages you to look at kids who misbehave as they are needing something. They're missing something and they have a need that needs to be met, so they're acting out. And if you can meet that need, that hate behavior can then be corrected versus just disciplining through the need. Especially with kids who have been in hard places and haven't been parented, have been neglected, and have been traumatized. That they have so many needs that haven't been met. Like one of our sons, he was 6 when he came, and he, I don't know how many times, anytime he'd meet somebody new, anytime I'd walk in the room, he'd say, "Can you pick me up?" He just wanted to be held because he hadn't been held as a baby. And you felt awkward picking up this 6-year-old little boy and hugging him, but that's what he needed. And so that's what my wife and I tried to, that was always a yes. Whether you have time, whether I had time or not, I always committed to, yeah, I'll pick you up and I'll hold you. And that went on for probably a year, that he wanted to be held. And eventually that need had been met. And then we were able to progress on to other behaviors. And so it's been a huge learning experience for my wife and I, how to help kids from hard places. And I definitely say we're not experts, but we've definitely, I think we've made some progress with the kids. And they've it's really been awesome to see the amount of progress that they've been able to make, basically once they felt loved and safe. Yeah.
Wow, Kevin, that is such a cool story. I think I mean it's just I'm just feeling like chills as you tell that because I mean it's a real lived raw experience of these kids that have dealt with so much trauma and so much challenge, and I appreciate that you share that perhaps that's the reason that you are there in Florida. I mean, there's probably various reasons why we're led where we are led, but those kids, their lives are forever changed and likely for generations to come changed because of that love. And I've observed the same thing you have just in your story, that most people don't hear discipline or correction until they hear love. And I
Mm-hmm.
know that's kind of maybe an old cliche statement that you don't care people how much you know till they know how much you care, that kind of a thing. But it's a true statement, and I've found that with my own family, and I've certainly found it with my patients as a physician. If I lecture them and tell them you must change this and you must change this, they don't hear much. They don't do much until they say like, well, the doctor actually cares about how it's going and will follow up on stuff and see how you're doing. And then once they do that, they'll kind of change. And I think it applies pretty broadly in our lives. And I'm inspired by what you've done. You and Hannah have just done an amazing work there in Florida.
Well, again, I think it was just, you know, I don't know if we could have escaped, doing it, and it was just like, it was just like ending up in Muncie. It wasn't something that I had planned, but I just feel like it was God's hand that led me there. And I just feel like God orchestrated this situation, for us. You know, like I said, this, we were told no, you're not going to get the kids, and then just how it almost miraculously, getting into the class ending, and being willing to take in the older boys for the holidays, and just how it kind of snowballed, or the dominoes fell into place. Um, you definitely can look back and see God's hand throughout the journey.
Well, this shows specifically for physicians and other healthcare, other people who are in the business of healing. And I think it's an instructive thing to think about this, because you probably never would have envisioned I'm going to be in this Blue Cross Blue Shield sort of clinic in the Panhandle of, or I'm going to be in Florida and adopt 4 kids when you already had a young family. You could have never seen it, and yet you've put yourself in a position where you could do that, and you're able to act when the opportunity knocked. It sounds like it kind of happened gradually, then suddenly, which is often how things happen.
Yeah,
Well, and
it seems like that's true. Yep.
one thing that kind of made me think was you were doing that is specific to your role as a physician. you've learned all this stuff about taking care of patients, about healthcare, about psychological care, and yet it's hard when it's your own kids. I've found for myself that you may have training on X, Y, and Z, but it's harder when you have to apply that to your own family, or like to be patient and loving and uh, charitable towards your own family. That can be hard. And then the second point I was thinking about is the financial preparation that allowed you to be able to do that and say, I have this job. I could use my financial gifts for a whole variety of things. And at that time, when you and your wife adopted those kids, we said we would do this, and we're doing it, even though it's hard and it's costly. But you were in a financial position so that you could do that. And I don't know. What do you think? Any thoughts on those two items?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost it's I don't understand finances very well because I just think it's just I'm always boggled by how we make it. Even though I do have a good salary, went to a medical school in the Caribbean, and it was probably the most expensive medical school you can go to, or one of the top, costly medical schools to go to. And obviously, like I said, my parents weren't wealthy and couldn't really help me out through medical school. They did help me out through college and got me, I graduated from undergrad debt free. But medical school obviously, was a big burden. And I'm not a financial guy, and going into it, and I'm kind of glad now I didn't understand that. Interest starts accruing on day one of medical school. As soon as
Maybe it
you
was good to go in blind.
yeah, I think sometimes I still have heart palpitations when I think about how much money that I borrowed to get through medical school, and then the compounding interest on top of that. I almost, by the time I started paying my loan back, I almost owed twice of what I had borrowed.
Wow.
And it was just like, I had a federal student loan that was pretty massive, but I just kind of looked at it as I'm renting a good career. So I was just like, I can make these payments. It's not fun, but this is a good career, and I just kind of just kept trusting God that things were gonna be okay. And He just continues to show faithful, and it. Uh, you know, and then with adopting the kids, we needed a bigger house, and as the housing isn't cheap. But we ended up moving into a bigger house, and we were just making it through in the little house, and we moved into a bigger house, and we continued to just make it through. So it's you know it's just amazing, how good things have gone for me, even though I don't understand how it happens. It's just uh, blows my mind sometimes um, to see how, I guess, blessed we have been. And I feel like it's because we are willing to step out in faith and do hard things a lot. And my wife is also very generous, and I think that kind of pays off. And I think what goes around comes around, I think people say. And I think her generosity brings us blessing in my house, because she just has such a generous spirit and is always willing to help others. And I just think that ends up paying off for us financially. And I'm definitely not, we're not like amazingly wealthy and have everything we want, but we're able to do things as a family and live you know a fairly normal life as a family. A family of four can do a lot of things. A family of nine, it's a little bit different.
Right. Oh yeah. Different
You know,
math.
the first time we went to the movies and spent $300, I was like, "What is going on here?" It's
That's so
like,
much. Wow.
Yeah, it was like ridiculous, and we split popcorn. And
Goodness.
so, just everything you do as a large family, it's compounded. But we just keep getting, I feel like we just keep getting blessed because we've chosen to do um, good things even though they're hard, maybe, I guess. And again, I can't explain some of the things that happen to us, but they are good. Like I said, I graduated with quite a large debt. In our residency program, I'm sure I had the most debt of anybody.
Yeah, you went to
Um,
that school. I bet it was pretty expensive.
yeah, it was expensive, and then we also had to travel to and from. My wife and I traveling down there, was $1,000 ticket a piece to get down there, and then um, we obviously had a baby while I was in medical school, and so just paying for a house for three people versus if you're single, you can share a house with somebody else or have a dorm room. So all those things just kind of added up. But um, I knew there was this public service loan forgiveness thing if you work for a non for profit and make 120 qualifying payments, which should pay off your loan anyway.
Right.
That it gets forgiven. And I was just kind of trusting that things would work out. I, I had classmates and colleagues that refinanced for lower interest rates, but I just always felt, that if I work for a non for profit and you know can make the payments when I can, um, I just always felt like things were going to work out. And then obviously, COVID happened, and the CARES Act came into place, and we also had a hurricane during those, I think, in the year after COVID, which did about $130,000 worth of damage to our house and property, some
Yikes.
of which wasn't covered by insurance. But because of the CARES Act and not having to pay my student loan during that time, we had put back enough, basically just enough to cover the repairs that we needed from the hurricane. And then with the changes that came with the student loan forgiveness program, they went back and included all your time of forbearance. I was like, I added everything up, and I was like, I'm all of a sudden eligible for this. And I applied, and I got a letter back and said my payment was zero and my principal was zero.
Oh wow, you should
I was
frame
just like,
that.
yeah,
You
just
should frame
completely
that
blown
letter.
away.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
and that I mean, we had gone several years without having to pay because of the CARES Act, and that was coming due, and kids in school and all that thing, the money had been sucked out, and I was like, I don't know how I'm going to start paying for my student loans again, and then I applied for that, and it was actually granted, and I was just kind of blown away and just dumbfounded that that happened. And again, I can't explain how easy it was, and because I listen to a lot of people say that that'll never happen. You'll never get your loans forgiven. Um, a lot of financial guys just believe that wasn't possible, and I really didn't think it was either for that large a sum. I thought it was going to be like school teachers and things like that who did the work for non for profit, obviously, with the smaller student loans would get theirs forgiven. I never imagined that they'd forgive that kind of debt, but it was great. And when I look back, I'd already paid off what I had borrowed in interest payments. So it's just, I didn't feel too bad about it either. But it was just an incredible blessing to have that happen to us. Just um, because we had made decisions, like taking the kids in that weren't wise financially, but we just thought it was the right thing to do. It was we had never lived. I would say we never lived extravagant, but we also, we could have lived a lot tighter and gotten my student loan paid off earlier. But I had a wife that went to a to a third world country so I could go to medical school. So I didn't necessarily feel good about making her suffer more, to get my loan paid off. So that was always kind of my attitude, that I didn't want my family to have to continue, you know, doing hard things in that regard. So, when we had, I could just make the minimal payment on my student loans. And so there was a lot that went into those decisions. But, again, just an amazing blessing that we received after, thinking, I was planning on kind of taking those into retirement for pretty much, just making the minimum payment. And, but, thanks to, some crazy, the CARES Act and other things that went down due to the pandemic, it was, worked out in our favor, I guess.
Well, I think as I think about the stuff we've talked about, Kevin, on this podcast, I think this story is going to be inspiring to lots of people because it's a story. It's just a real story of not knowing your next step, but taking it anyway, and understanding that there's this potential of what you can do. Not being foolish along the way in any step, but it's not like you had this orchestrated 15-year plan that you took step by step, and now we can see it happening exactly. You're following God's direction in your life, but you're also just trying to make prudent decisions as it comes on. A quick question I was going to ask you is, if you were to go to someone who was 10 or 15 years behind you, starting that journey, what advice would you give them I guess, especially from a financial standpoint? What would you tell somebody who is beginning medical school and looking at some of those same type of challenges like you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I lecture people all the time. Any kid that comes to my office that says they want to do medicine, I offer, hey, you can come shadow me, anytime you want. And but my I guess my words of advice is to get the best education you can as cheap as you can. You know, I went to my pre med school was non accredited, and that was part of my problem getting into medical school. That there were some schools that wouldn't even look at my application because my undergrad school was not accredited. Um, but again, I think everything worked out, according to God's plan to get me to where I needed to be, and I had a very good education. It was 5 years between graduation and taking the MCAT, and I still feel like I remembered most of what I needed to know. So I encourage people to get the best education as cheap as you can.
And go somewhere accredited, probably.
Yeah,
That would
now
be
I
a
definitely
helpful,
recommend that,
yeah, in hindsight.
um, but also from the college that I graduated from, especially in the southeast area, they're not having problems getting into medical school anymore. Just because they've seen the success of prior graduates, I
Yeah.
think. Um, but so that's one I tell them, and I also encourage uh, people to, if you don't know what you want to major in college, uh, do something that you can be employed as if you decide not to go to medicine. If
That's
you
good
decide not
advice.
to continue your career, do something that you can have a job. I think engineering is a great undergraduate degree because not only are you able to get a job after you graduate from with an engineering degree, but also we need those type of minds in medicine. Though that's usable in medicine. Obviously, computer science, is a great field that we need integrated with medicine. I think that's a lot of our problems in medicine is that, the main tool that we use now, computers, the people who program the computers don't understand medicine. and we don't have enough doctors that understand computers well enough to make good programs. I think having somebody with knowledge of both is great. So I encourage people to obviously do the courses that are needed to take the MCAT, but to either do an undergraduate degree that they're really going to enjoy, or something that's employable. So I think medical colleges really look for people who are interesting, and not just me, not Caucasian male, pre med, middle of the class. That's they want somebody who's interesting, obviously, um, and I think the more interesting they can make their application, the better medical student they're gonna be. But sometimes life gets in the way too. You want to get married, or change your life goals during college. So I just think doing something where you can be employed at the end of college is a pretty wise
Oh,
move.
that's really wise, Kevin, for
Yeah,
sure. Think about
because
that.
at pre-medicine, I didn't feel like I was, what am I qualified to do now as a
Just medical,
pre-medicine
yeah,
degree?
just medical
So,
school.
but I ended up going. I got a master's degree in sports medicine, and exercise physiology. And I loved what I did. Between undergrad and medical school. It was hard to leave my position as an athletic director because, I always said I bled orange and blue. I loved the school that I was at. And I had built a good program, and worked hard at it, and you know, I shed a lot of tears. Having to leave there and to go on to this adventure of being a doctor. And but I knew I could always go back and do that again if I wanted to stop being a doctor. But the longer I waited, it was going to be harder to ever try to be a doctor, and I felt like I would have regrets if I didn't continue my dream, I guess, to be a doctor. And it's fun now because I've been able to coach my kids' teams here and there, even though I a doctor, and choose not to do that now because I get too passionate, and it gives me indigestion. So I let other people do that, and just enjoy watching them play.
It's neat. I think, Kevin, as I look at it, like you're just one of those guys that really makes a difference. I mean, you've got this family, and you've got a practice that you're passionate about, and you're taking care of those kids that you've adopted. You've got this wonderful family, and you've figured out and learned both financial and life lessons on the way. And I think this interview will be instructive for lots of people that listen to it for all those reasons, that we don't have to go into this as the shining perfect story. You go through and say, look, this is real life, step by step, and look what a tremendous difference you can make in the world, and how much you can help your family and people on the way. But uh, yeah, I've loved it, Kevin. Any other thoughts, parting thoughts, as we kind of finish up here? I just think I've really enjoyed catching up with you, and hearing your insights.
Yeah, no, it's been great. I appreciate opportunity to share. I think more than anything, I think the story about the kids, if I can, I assume probably other professionals are listening to this, and if you have the means to do something in the foster system, I think that's huge. And you don't have to take in 4 kids at one time, which I really don't recommend to anybody anymore.
That's a lot all at
But
once, for sure.
taking in one is doable, or just helping another foster family out on the weekend is doable. There is a program called Guardian Ad Litem, where you're the legal representative in court for kids in the foster system. So there are just lots of there's lots of needs in the foster system, and there are kids out there who are, you know, our kids, when they came, they said they never felt like anybody loved them, for their whole life, had never had one adult that even liked them.
That's
And that's a hard place. And so just being a big brother, big sister to a kid in the foster system, a mentor, help them with their schoolwork, just anything you can do for those kids, can really impact their life.
I think you're right. My wife has been a guardian ad litem for the last couple of years for some kids who are going through some similar situations in our area, and I mean it's hard work, but it's amazing. And I think what you said, the kids need to feel that there's an adult in their life that really cares about them and loves them. And I think that's one of the keys to success for every kid is to say, there's somebody cheering for me. And often it's a parent, but sometimes people are born in homes where the parents can't or won't fill that role. And sometimes being able to do that as a community member or as a guardian ad litem or as a foster parent or someone that's just giving foster relief could make a big difference. I honor what you're doing, Kevin. I think you and Hannah have made a tremendous difference in the lives of those kids.
Well, I'm just a tool and a bigger plan, I think. So I
Yeah,
appreciate you saying that, but I just kind of go where I'm led, I guess.
that's awesome. Well, Kevin, I think we'll sign off. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it, and I know our audience will love listening to it. I've sure enjoyed it, and I'll appreciate it. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Nice seeing you.
Thanks.